Hello, readers, and welcome to another episode of Reading in the Middle, the podcast that brings middle grade stories and their storytellers front and center. I am your host, Annisha Jeffries, Youth Services Manager at the Cleveland Public Library. Today's guest is someone whose stories have helped readers feel seen, soothed, and a little less alone. Bobbie Pyron, librarian turned author, ocean dreamer, and lifelong lover of animals, has given us unforgettable books like Stay, Lucky Strike, The Dogs of Winter, and her latest novel in verse, Octopus Moon. In this episode, we talk about big feelings, brave kids, and the healing power of the ocean. You'll hear about how Bobbie's love of the sea shaped her storytelling, and why verse was the perfect form for Pearl's story, and what it really means to write with honesty and hope for young readers. So, grab your headphones, your heart, and maybe a seashell or two, because we're about to dive deep. Hi, Bobbie. Welcome to Reading in the Middle. How are you today?
I'm good, thank you. I'm so happy to be here.
Your real-life story feels like a novel itself. Growing up by the ocean, working in bookstores, singing in a rock band, becoming a librarian, and finally an author. How do all of these twists and turns sneak into stories you tell, whether it's the snowy streets of Dogs of Winter or the sunny skate parks of Octopus Moon?
Oh, that's a great question, and I'm glad you're linking all those together. You know, there's little bits of me and my experience now and also growing up in every one of my books. But I've noticed, Octopus Moon is my 8th book, and I have noticed a similar theme in all of my books, and that is probably the theme of loss and healing and resilience. And that very much comes from my own experience and my own childhood.
You knew you wanted to be a writer by the time you were 9. If you could sit down with your 9-year-old self, maybe the one reading Casey, the Utterly Impossible Horse, what would you tell yourself about the journey ahead?
The journey that matters, not the destination. I was 50 when my first book was published, so I am very much a late bloomer. I worked as a librarian for many, many years, which was the perfect job for me. And I think it's the best job in the entire world, actually. But it took me until I was 50 to realize that 9-year-old girl's dream. And so I think I would tell her to never give up on your dreams, but to also be patient and just embrace the journey and not worry so much about, are you going to get published?
In Octopus Moon, we meet Pearl, a sensitive, brave girl facing depression and anxiety. Where did Pearl's story begin with you? And why did it feel so important to tell her story right now?
Well, this is such a timely topic, especially right now, because May is National Mental Health Awareness Month. And it's very important to me to bring awareness to the fact that we do have a mental health crisis in this country, not just for adults, but also for children. As a matter of fact, the Surgeon General several years ago declared a mental health emergency among children and teenagers. I think the pandemic made it worse, but, it's always been there. I was very depressed when I was a child, which is, very much where Pearl's character came from. But that was back in the 60s, and nobody talked about mental illness, and they never believed that a child could be dealing and living with chronic depression and anxiety. So there were no therapists for me, and there were no books where I could see myself. And so, it took me a long time to get the courage and the confidence to decide to write this book. But I finally did, because I just felt like it was so important. And you were starting to see, and you are probably aware of this, you were starting to see more main characters for this age group dealing with mental illness. Before, it was always a parent or a grandparent or a sibling who was living with a mental illness, but I wanted the main character of this age, Pearl is 10 going on 11, to be confronted with this. That was important to me because it was a book that my 10-year-old self very much needed.
Bobbie, you've written unforgettable animal companions in Stray and A Dog's Way Home. In Octopus Moon, the ocean almost becomes Pearl's companion, sometimes comforting, sometimes overwhelming. How did your love of the sea inspire this part of Pearl's emotional world?
I grew up on the Gulf of Mexico in the panhandle of Florida, also known as the Redneck Riviera. And the ocean was so important to me. As a matter of fact, when my mother's water broke, when she was pregnant with me, she was swimming in the ocean. So I like to say I've got a little seawater in my veins, but in my family, the ocean was always there. And, to have that consistency in my very chaotic childhood was so important to me. And just the magic of it and the comfort of it was important. At the same time, I've always felt like, to some degree, the ocean is a bit of a metaphor for people who live day to day with depression, because we're really good at pulling into our turtle shells or camouflaging ourselves like an octopus does. We may look very calm on the surface like an ocean does, but underneath there is, can be a lot going on. You also feel like with depression, you feel like there is a separation between you and the world. You can see the light up there, and you can see people moving around, but there's a separation between you and that. And so the ocean has always kind of served as a metaphor for me as to, some of the different issues with living with chronic depression.
Yes. Like Lucky Strike and The Dogs of Winter, what's it like stepping into poetry for Pearl's voice? Was it free? Challenging? Both.
Oh my gosh. So I love novels in verse. I absolutely love reading novels in verse, especially Jason Reynolds and Jacqueline Woodson. And Stay, that half of it is written in free verse. The dog's chapters are in free verse. And as an artist, I'm always wanting to stretch myself. So I decided I'm going to try writing a whole book in free verse. This is going to be a lot of fun. It was not. It was really, really hard. I had to think so much, and I really try when I'm writing my first draft not to think very much, just to let the story come, let the characters do what they want. And then in the second and third drafts, I really, think and tighten things up. I'm not a plotter at all. But with writing in verse, every word has heavy lifting to do, like in a picture book, and gave me a whole new appreciation for my friends who are picture book authors, all the heavy lifting that every word has to do. So it was very, very challenging for me in that regard. Will I ever write another novel in verse? Right now, I don't think so, but, never say never. But I grew a lot writing that book.
Skateboarding, with all its falls and getting back up, feels like a perfect metaphor for Pearl's emotional journey. Why was it important for you to show the everyday joys and challenges like skateboarding with Rosie alongside her bigger struggles?
I actually have a very good friend. My best friend here is named Rosie, and she talks in exclamation points, and she's very much like the main character. But it was important for me to have a Rosie and have a Mia, and to see their reckoning with how depression affected their good friend. Because I also wrote this book not just so that kids who are living with a mental illness can feel seen, but I also wanted kids who may have a good friend or a parent or someone that they're close to who is struggling with a mental illness, particularly depression, to see what it's like. It's not just having a bad day. It's not just being overly sensitive or a phase that they're going through. It is an illness. And so I wanted the book to be that window for that reader, as well as a mirror for the reader who does live with a mental illness.
There's a moment when Pearl is called moody, a word so many kids hear. In your books, words really matter. How do you approach writing about the labels adults sometimes give kids, and how kids carry them?
I think we do tend to. It's very convenient for us to label other people as weird or mentally ill or whatever, because then we don't have to think. We can just put them in a box. That was something that I really wanted to address and stay, which if your listeners are not familiar with that book, it is a book that looks at the whole issue of people experiencing homelessness and how we tend to stigmatize them and label them as mentally ill or drug addicted or lazy or whatever. And it's just so that we don't really have to see the person as a person.
Bobbie, you've had such a colorful life, harvesting flowers, training dogs, even rocking out on stage. If you could weave one of those wild jobs into a future book, which one would you pick? And what kind of kid would star in it?
My goodness. Boy, that is a good question, because, being a dog trainer, being a, singer in a rock and roll band, harvesting flowers, outdoor wilderness instructor, were all things that led me to where I am. Probably I would choose outdoor wilderness instructor. I've thought actually many times about, writing a story about a kid who has to go to one of we call them hoods in the woods, in one of these camps for kids who are having difficulties, and, they do all these different things in the wilderness, camping. But so that would certainly be something that would interest me. I could imagine letting my inner rebel come through that kid.
When you imagine a young reader, maybe someone feeling a little bit lost or worried, finding Octopus Moon on a library shelf or in a bookstore, what do you hope happens when they turn the final page?
I hope what they feel is that there is hope out there. You're not alone. There are ways that you can live with this chronic illness. Didn't want to sugarcoat it and say, probably when you're an adult, you won't have this anymore. You're going to outgrow it, because that is often not the case. It happens sometimes, but there is hope. There are therapists. There are tools for dealing with this, but you have to be willing to reach out and talk with someone. You have to talk with your parents. If you don't feel comfortable talking with your parents, talk to a school counselor or a teacher. And I know that's scary, but you have to do that to get on that path to hope and to healing.
You spent more than 3 decades surrounded by young readers as a librarian. How did that front row seat in kids' real lives, their dreams, worries, and struggles shape the way you write characters like Pearl, Lucky, Ivan?
Yeah. I think the main way it shaped me was seeing how much kids love books and how they connect with characters. Some kids, a lot of kids still like to read fantasy, but even if they're reading fantasy, that character has to have relatable problems, relatable characteristics, challenges. So that was something that was very instructive to me when I started writing. I wanted to make sure that my characters were multidimensional and that they were realistic, that kids could see themselves. Even a kid like Piper, who was with her family experiencing homelessness. She was the new kid in school. How many of us have had that experience? And, it's really is very difficult. I had it a lot growing up. it really showed me how your characters, as you're crafting them, need to have many different dimensions to their personalities.
Okay, Bobbie, it's time for our rapid fire round. No thinking, just answer. First thing that comes to mind. Cats or dogs?
Dogs.
Write by hand or type on a computer?
Type on a computer.
Favorite book? You were 10 years old.
The book when I was 10 was The Season of Ponies by Zilpha Snyder. I can't remember. She's got
Morning writer or night owl?
late morning, middle of the day writer.
Dream travel destination?
Scotland.
Favorite comfort food?
Grits.
Verse, novel, or traditional prose? Which is harder to write?
First novel, yeah.
Music while writing? Yes or no?
Always.
If you could be any sea creature besides an octopus, what would you be?
A mermaid.
If Octopus Moon became a movie, who would you cast as Pearl?
Shoot. I don't know a lot of the young actresses now. I don't, yeah.
That's okay. What's the best piece of advice you ever got?
My mother said, never say never.
Little readers, such powerful characters to hold on to. Pearl, Piper, Lucky, Ivan, kids who fight through fear, loneliness, and change. If you could leave your readers, especially those struggling right now, with one message from all of your stories, what would it be?
I think my one message that I hope comes through in all of my stories is the power of connection. You know, we always say family is the most important thing, but what is family? Sometimes family is our biological family, and they're not always the healthiest family for us. But family can also be friends. They can be, classmates, but just having connection so that you're not dealing with things alone. You have that support, I think, is probably the most important thing. Reach out. Even if you're shy, reach out and make connection, because everybody needs friends.
Bobbie, if our listeners wanted to connect with you on social media, where can they find you?
So I have a wonderful new website, and it's just BobbiePyron.com. I'm also active on Facebook, just under Bobbie Pyron, also on Twitter, which I refuse to call X.
Me too.
Yes. And I am on Instagram. I mostly post pictures of my dogs and wildflowers and things I spend a lot of time in the woods, but I do post some authory, writerly things. But so I am on those 3 social media platforms.
Can you share any upcoming books that's coming up next for our listeners?
Well, I'm hoping to have some good news to share in the next few weeks. My wonderful editor, Stacy Barney of Octopus Moon, has just read another novel of mine and is very, very interested in it. So my agent and I are on pins and needles waiting to see what's going to happen with that, but I can't really say anything yet. And then I'm working on another book. Again, I love to challenge myself, so I'm really going outside of my comfort zone, and I'm writing a fantasy.
Oh, I'm excited. A fantasy novel. Ooh, I can't wait for that. You hear that, listeners? Bobbie, thank you so much for being on Reading in the Middle. This was such a wonderful conversation. And readers, pick up your copy of Octopus Moon and Bobbie's other titles, because May is Mental Health Awareness Month. And this does tie in to that. And Bobbie, it was such a pleasure. Again, thank you so much for being on Reading in the Middle.
Thank you so much. And again, I so appreciate being here and talking with you, especially during May, Mental Health Awareness Month.
Thank you. I'm so grateful to Bobbie Pyron for joining me today and sharing the story behind Octopus Moon and the real-life waves that shaped her journey. Whether it's Pearl's learning to stand steady through her anxiety, Piper finding safety and stay, or Lucky getting struck by more than just lightning, Bobbie's characters remind us that there's always a way forward and always someone who understands. If you haven't yet picked up Octopus Moon, it's a tender, powerful, and unforgettable story. And if you loved today's episode, don't forget to subscribe, leave a review, and share Reading in the Middle with the big-hearted readers in your life. Until next time, keep reading, keep dreaming, and remember, sometimes the bravest thing you can do is just keep swimming.